these issues that affect a lot of people in the province. And if we have a bill that can address, that can help our professional people in our facilities that are looking after those issues, if it can help them improve the kind of service that they can provide the public, and indeed help them in making their place of work and the way that they do work happier, less stressful, very productive, Mr. Speaker, then that's certainly, you know, the way to go on that. Mr. Speaker, I would like to just end by saying that this is really a step in the right direction, that all three parties here can take a few minutes to think about it, and I think it's a way that the government, you know, can walk down that road of listening and helping people make improvements to the system. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, this is a system that is worth saving. And you know, when I know, you know, recently in the last session we heard that line where everything is on the table, and I think a lot of people at home, they were very concerned about that kind of language. They're not really sure what that means. I'm not really sure what that means. And they are concerned about, you know, what kind of road are we traveling on. So I look at this as a positive step, maybe down the right road that we really need to stay on, and that's a road to protect our public health care system in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So I want to say thanks to all of our people in these professions. Good luck to them in the future, and I look forward to this bill going to law amendments. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm certainly pleased to rise this evening and speak on Bill 11, which is Licensed Practical Nurses Act, and also, like the previous Bill 7, is going to give this very, very important profession their autonomy and a self-regulating college or council. And I think the time has really come for this, because the role of the LPN has expanded immensely, certainly in the new healthcare delivery, whether it's in our hospitals, in our home care, or in our health centers. There are important roles for the LPN to carry out. So I think this is an appropriate time for government to bring forth the self-governance that they do request. Also, of course, as mentioned earlier, when we talk about the role, there's also an expanding scope of practice for the LPN, and I'm sure all of us in our constituency work know LPNs, know the kind of work that they do, and certainly in the last decade, their role in the delivery of home care indeed has become very prominent, and in fact, you know, home care would just not thrive without the LPN. Currently, in fact, all of the graduates of the community college program can in fact be hired in most areas of the province. Which brings me to the point that I think having this LPN Act and their governance body, I think their board to set down the requirements for the profession, I think is very, very important here, because across the country there are many different standards that exist in the training of LPNs. And in fact, it's my understanding that some of these courses can be done online. And again, in other provinces across the country, there's a whole array of standards that do exist. So I think it's important here for the province to support the role of the LPN with good regulations that will be certainly determined by the college and with of course the approval of the governing council. So I think as trying to expand and meet some of our healthcare needs, the role of the LPN will be an important one. I think it will give them that sense of greater independence, that they can operate, I think, stronger on their own with more detailed definition of the work that they can do and the protection that a board and council would afford them. And also, of course, we know that there are less nurses often hired now in our hospitals and healthcare centers, and the role of the LPN is having to come in and certainly carry out some of the functions that were once pretty primary duties of nurses. So to work under the guidance of a registered nurse, I guess this act will allow and set out the kinds of areas, whether it's assessment of clients or collaborating in a nursing plan, implementation of the nursing plan, and ongoing evaluation of the client. So these are pretty strong dimensions that the LPN will now undertake under this act. And some of the areas, of course, it also the act will create the fitness to practice, education, which we all know in any profession. And that's the point that perhaps I would like to make the strongest about is the LPN is a true profession and needs to be recognized now through the LPN Act. And certainly education is a major ongoing component of any professional's life today, and certainly as the LPN expand their role in the delivery of health care in Nova Scotia. And also whether it's complaints, reinstatement, professional conduct committees to monitor its members, I think the structure that the LPN Act will put into place will certainly facilitate those kinds of activities, and I think will give a greater sense of professionalism to LPN work in this province. And like all members, look forward to this bill going to law amendments and hearing from these professionals who will, I'm sure, come forward to speak on the kinds of directions that they hope to see under this piece of legislation. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak on Bill 11.
Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to speak briefly to Bill 11, the Licensed Practical Nurse Act. Mr. Speaker, it was only, I think, last year in the spring session that we arrived here one day at the legislature, and there were a group of nurses, licensed practical nurses, down in the foyer, handing out information about what it is that LPNs do, and checking the blood pressure of the members as we came into the chamber. Probably a good time to do it, Mr. Speaker, before we had gotten in here too long, when perhaps our blood pressure would have changed somewhat over the course of the debate. Mr. Speaker, it is important, this particular piece of legislation, in the same way that Bill 7 is an important piece of legislation, because underpinning this bill is I think the genuine sentiment of respect for a very important group of healthcare workers in our healthcare system. LPNs want it to be known and want to make it very clear that they are nurses. They are also nurses in our healthcare system, that they are a unique part of the healthcare system, that they have a particular body of skills and talents to offer in the healthcare system, and that they need to be respected and valued on that basis. And I know, Mr. Speaker, as somebody who's a social worker who has worked in a acute care or a medical facility, that sometimes it's hard in a system that is, you know, after all, Mr. Speaker, let's be frank, a system that can be quite hierarchical in terms of an ordering of healthcare providers or professions, especially with a very strong and a very skilled and talented medical profession. Certainly other groups in the healthcare system sometimes feel that their unique talents and skills aren't necessarily as well recognized by either the public or certainly by their political representatives, and they always feel fairly strongly that they need to assert what it is that they do and have us understand and recognize and value what it is that they do. And Mr. Speaker, I recognize that this particular piece of legislation isn't about remuneration, but I think when we look at the changes in our healthcare system and the changes I spoke to earlier with respect to nurses no longer doing the same, performing the same kinds of work, and the rigors and the demands of a changed healthcare system, one that demands a different knowledge base, one that demands that nurses work in a variety of different settings. The LPNs, these nurses, the licensed practical nurses, have not been protected from that reality. In fact, they have been very much impacted by those changing realities as well, Mr. Speaker. And I think it would be fair to say, where this government has remunerated registered nurses in recognition for the change in the kind of demands that the healthcare system has placed on nurses. That hasn't necessarily been the case for LPNs, and this is something that I think we probably need to continue to have some public discussion about, is the remuneration of a group, of this particular group. Mr. Speaker, there are many LPNs in our province today who have worked for many, many years in our healthcare system, and once again, you know, like other health providers, they do have that demographic sort of time bomb inside their profession. A large cohort of LPNs who are now in their late 40s, mid 50s, who will be leaving the profession shortly. The Nova Scotia Community College offers training in the LPN field, and as I understand, Mr. Speaker, this particular program is always completely full, and there is this demonstrates the demand and as well the interest in the province to take training to be a licensed practical nurse and to make a contribution to our healthcare system. And I think this is a very it's something that's a very good thing, Mr. Speaker. So this legislation will strengthen the self-regulation of licensed practical nurses. As the Minister of Transportation said, this bill had not been reviewed for some time, the Act, and it required an overhaul to, keep up to the current realities and to reflect a situation where the regulation, the self-regulation, and the governance of LPNs will stay up to speed, pretty much, Mr. Speaker. It makes it possible for LPNs to continue to be self-regulating. And so I think that pretty much we here in the chamber think it's a good thing that the government has finally brought forward this legislation and the changes that are required for LPNs. And we will look forward to hearing from members of the licensed practical nursing profession in front of the Law Amendments Committee. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few minutes also to speak on Bill number 11, which is with regard to licensed practical nurses. And I guess my comments are more with regard to the concept. I'm glad to see that we're at a stage in the healthcare system that we are allowing the self-regulation of licensed practical nurses, which I guess years ago they were called CNAs, Certified Nursing Assistants. And as time has moved on, and it's almost been sort of like a shuffle of responsibilities where I know in my mother's day when she was a nurse, RNs were doing a lot of, and they still do, I'm sure, a lot of that work right in the wards, and the CNAs had a different role. It's almost like everything has shifted to some extent. More the administrative burden has gone to the RNs, and the LPNs have taken on a role that is very much more frontline, as well, as I said, as the RNs and others. But I think the role of the LPNs has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's glad to see self-regulation as something that is coming about. The ability for this organization, as I think the member from Kings West said, I'll echo his comments, that this is a profession. And I recall only a few years ago that there was one member of this House, and I will note a former member of this House, when speaking to LPNs, questioned whether they were really nurses. And maybe that's why he's no longer a member of this House, Mr. Speaker. But no one can question the fact that LPNs do nursing, that they provide a service that is valuable to the healthcare profession in Nova Scotia, healthcare to the nursing profession. And the more that we can do to ensure not only that we professionalize the LPN services that they provide, but also provide them with the rights and responsibilities that go with being a profession, I think the better off our healthcare system will be. And overall, I think, as I didn't get a chance to speak on Bill number 7, I want to say of the nursing profession, a noble profession, one that I think we all know, both in recent political times, but also historically, the importance of the profession, the work they've done in Nova Scotia and throughout Canada is invaluable. It is without a doubt that our healthcare system could not function, not only because of the professional work they do, but the compassion that they show. And in many cases, even the social work they are doing while they are doing their job. It's that kind of work, that kind of commitment that has allowed our healthcare system as we know it to survive over many challenges, over many years, and in many ways it's the nurses that are the backbone of that system. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on that. I'm glad to have an opportunity to put some stuff on the record, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that our caucus will be supporting Bill number 11, and we'll be glad to hear any comments at law amendments. Thank you.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works will be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to express my appreciation to all members who have participated in this debate, and Their comments of support are certainly appreciated, and we look forward to seeing the bill proceed to law amendments and back to the House for further consideration. Thank you.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 11. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Opposed by nay. Motion is carried.
Bill numbered 11, entitled An Act Respecting Licensed Practical Nurses.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to call Bill 58, Justice Administration Amendment Act, for second reading.
Bill number 58, the Justice Administration Amendment Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker. On behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, I'm pleased to begin the second reading of the Justice Administration Amendment 2006 Act, which is an omnibus bill. This act, Mr. Speaker, covers several amendments. Amendments to the Condominium Act will ensure that the Condominium Act filing requirements are consistent with the Land Registration Act. As you know, Mr. Speaker, recent amendments to the Land Registration Act have made some references in the Condominium Act obsolete. Also, filing requirements under the Land Registration Act have created inconsistent filing procedures when compared to the Condominium Act. Mr. Speaker, the amendments are necessary to deal with these inconsistencies and correct the Condominium Act references to the Land Registration Act. In addition, Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Business Electronic Filing Act will allow the continued easy flow of business information between Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations and the Canada Revenue Agency. An amendment to the Motor Vehicle Act will define the beginning and end locations of a temporary work area. The change is required to give police and motorists clear advice on where speeding fines will double when Bill 254 is proclaimed on January 1st, 2007. Amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act to double speeding fines in school zones and temporary work areas received royal assent in 2005. Mr. Speaker, an amendment to the Public Highways Act gives the Minister of Transportation and Public Works the power to extinguish a portion of an old public highway that is considered surplus to government needs. This will increase the effectiveness and efficiency of routine land disposals. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the bill amends a section of the Court and Administration Reform Act to allow Transportation and Public Works to manage routine land disposals. I look forward to comments from members opposite today, and with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of this bill.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few moments to speak on Bill number 58, a bill that our caucus will be supporting to see it move forward to law amendments. We'll be glad to hear any comments there. Again, one of these bills, I think it's worth noting, and I'm sure the leader of the Liberal Party may also note it, but again, a just administration bill, omnibus bills that are brought into the House, ones that we used to see maybe once a year, beginning to see them now twice a year. And I guess for the record, there's a difference between bills that maybe are cleaning up justice issues, and now we see bills that are beginning to clean up other jurisdictions. So now this bill, I think, primarily deals with Service Nova Scotia as compared to even justice issues. So one that I'll just put on the record our concerns. These are bills on the Condominium Act and other things that maybe should be introduced separately. It may take a little longer to debate them, but that's what we're here to do. That's what the House is for, so that we can have a legitimate and I think particularly, Mr. Speaker, there may be people who, you know, if they're looking for certain pieces of legislation, they see Justice Administration Act, they're not necessarily going to know that inside there are amendments to the Condominium Act or the Public Highways Act or what have you. So I think it's something that needs to be considered, and I'll just put that on the record. The other comment I'll make is that there is a clause in this bill with regard to temporary workplaces and the doubling of fines and having to change the definition of workplace. I think I'd also like to note that that was a piece of legislation that this House passed, I believe, in 2005, might have been 2004, And like another piece of legislation, I think Bill 61 that's before the House right now, it's being brought back through this bill to be fixed. Because even though we passed it in 2005, they did not have the legal authority to actually not proclaim it, but to enforce it because they were missing certain sections. That is something that we have seen too often in the last little while, and I would hope that as a government that is something that we could easily avoid. There's no need for us to have to bring bills back. The government passed a bill in 2005. This House said it was the right thing to do, and as a result, people thought they were going to get doubling of fines at both temporary workplaces. And now, Mr. Speaker, we have to come back again and fix it. And that's unfortunate. And I would hope that the government, when they introduce it the first time, would make sure with the staff that they have, with the bureaucrats they have working for them, it should make it possible to resolve these things before they come before the House. And if it takes a little longer, a month or two to get it right, then let's get it right the first time. I think Nova Scotians can expect that of their legislature. So overall, glad to see this bill go forward to law amendments. We'll be looking forward to any comments there before we bring it back to the House for further debate. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and very briefly on Bill 58. Basically, I could almost repeat all of my comments from last week when we had the spring version of the Justice Administration Act, and now this is the fall version of it. So as my colleague from the NDP just said, we used to get these once a year, now we're getting them once a session. So it's extremely unfortunate when Nova Scotians are watching and they expect that in this chamber we're going to be able to pass legislation that is effective and that is correct. And by continually bringing forward these Justice Administration Acts, which seems that each year more and more acts are being included for amendments. And as was pointed out earlier, for the average person sitting at home who reads that a Justice Administration Act was tabled, they have absolutely no idea that this act is talking about changes to the Business Electronic Filing Act, to the Condominium Act, to the Court and Administration Reform Act, to the Expropriation Act, and to the Motor Vehicle Act, to the Public Highways Act, most of which have nothing to do with justice, yet they're all falling under this bill. And Mr. Speaker, we all know the frustration that we hear from Nova Scotians when they see that legislation has been passed by this House, for which, in the most part, they had no idea was even being brought forward, especially since this government has never been one to want to give much notice of law amendments when that committee is going to sit. So unfortunately, many Nova Scotians are being denied the opportunity to speak on these specific bills. But Mr. Speaker, we look forward to this bill moving on to law amendments. I'm hoping that any interested parties in the changes that are taking place will be given the opportunity and a notice to come forward with any concerns they may have. And again, we certainly hope that the government will be reminiscent of the importance of bringing forward proper legislation that's been reviewed carefully before being presented to the House, and that we don't continually have these Justice Administration Acts coming time and time again. And that's certainly not a critique of the hard-working civil servants who put their time on this legislation, but sometimes I can certainly tell from my experience in 9 years and the last 7 years, this government tends to work at the last minute on a lot of legislation, and last-minute pieces brought to this House tend to result in Justice Administration Act appearances shortly down the road. And again, I hold the government responsible for that, not the men and women who work very hard in bringing this legislation forward, in many cases under very strict deadlines and very little time to get that done. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I think I've chastised the government enough on Bill number 58, and we look forward to it moving forward to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to rise for a couple of minutes also to speak on Bill 58. It's sort of a grab bag of a whole collection of different things that's thrown under the Justice Act here, but it's, I guess, a real smorgasbord of different things, and unrelated to one another, but I guess housekeeping matters that the government has to put together to keep the business of government going. There's a Business Electronic Filing Act that basically providing certain information to the minister. I see there's something to do with condominiums. A lot of condominiums certainly in the metro area, but where I come from, I think we only have 1 or 2 in Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, I'll mention we have a beautiful condominium actually at overlooking Monroe's Island, or Doctor's Island as it's sometimes known. But this act would provide that all plans and diagrams to be provided to the Registrar of Condominiums. There's another section on the Expropriation Act and the Court and Administrative Reform Act. But really what I'd like to take a minute to speak about, Mr. Speaker, is the Motor Vehicle Act changes, and talking about doubling the fines in a school zone. I guess I can relate to that, having been caught at one time in the past for speeding in a school zone and paid my fine. And but it's certainly important that we do slow down in areas where there's children. And if they're double the fine now, that doesn't bother me. Maybe at the time it would have, but I think it's important that we protect our children within prescribed zones. And the other item that was mentioned here in the same act is doubling the fines in temporary work areas. And we all know that these are areas that are the work zones for people that work for the Department of Transportation or people that work for private contractors. And it's important that we allow them to have a safe and work-free zone or safe zone from any danger. And so it's important we all slow down and obey those highway signs. Certainly it's inconvenient by times. You're driving along and you're held up by construction, but we know that it's a safe workplace is vital. And I guess I can relate personally to that, Mr. Speaker, having known an individual I grew up with that was unfortunately hit in a construction zone as a worker, as a flagman, and was severely injured and died before his time, direct related to his accident. So it's vital that we do have the penalties in place to slow people down and protect our workers, that whether they're with the government department or whether they're with a private contractor. And the final part of this act, Mr. Speaker, is relating to, I guess, the government's ability to close public roads, and I guess I wonder why is it would government would want to close a public road? I suppose if there's a real safety concern or if there's some environmental disaster, it's a possibility, but it's probably, I'm guessing, relating more to unusable roads that are being abandoned for new construction, or roads that are no longer needed for public highways. And I guess the only caveat there, Mr. Speaker, I'd have is that we have to be careful, make sure that nobody is landlocked or nobody loses their ability to get to their property. And in the past, we've run across situations like that where a road has been long abandoned and people no longer have access to their private property. And we've all seen the service access roads along the Trans-Canada Highway that give woodlot owners and others right to their property, but occasionally there's roads that are abandoned or closed by government when people then no longer can get to their private property, and that's a concern or something to think about for sure. But overall, Mr. Speaker, I think the bill contains some good measures, and I certainly listen to what my colleagues may have to say and look forward to moving along to Law Amendments Committee. Thank you.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. It will be to close the debate on the bill. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the members of the opposition parties for their helpful comments. Although there was some question about the form where some of these clauses appeared in the legislation, they all said, or all recommended that knew that the clauses were good ones and the changes in legislation were needed. So I want to thank them for supporting the changes in legislation which are incorporated in this bill. And with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I will close debate on Bill number 58.
The motion is for second reading on Bill number 58, the Justice Administration Amendment Act. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill 58, entitled an act respecting the administration of justice.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call Bill 20, Public Utilities Act.
Bill 20, the Public Utilities Act. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to move second reading of Bill 20, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes Act 1989, the Public Utilities Act. This bill, as the members of the House know, prevents Nova Scotia Power from being granted more than one general rate increase in any 12-month period, unless the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board determines that exceptional circumstances exist that cause substantial financial harm to the ratepayers of Nova Scotia or to Nova Scotia Power itself. It's an important bill, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to hearing what opposition members have to say about it. It's an important bill because it helps in the budget planning for average Nova Scotians. Most of my constituents, Mr. Speaker, are on limited or fixed budgets, and multiple rate increases are something that they can't absorb in their budget. And so this is an important bill, but it does so, Mr. Speaker, in a fashion that respects the fluctuations that happen in global marketplaces and the pressures that they may cause on Nova Scotia Power. Anyway, with just that very brief introduction, I look forward to hearing the insights of opposition members on this very important bill.
The Honourable Member for Halifax, Shabukto.
Well, thank you all for inviting me to give the after-dinner address, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your warm and fulsome introduction. It was about as long, I think, as the Minister's speech and explanation of his bill. I find it odd that we've been given such a short introduction to this legislation, and in fact, I find it even odder that we've been given such a short bill. We know that no legislation, especially no legislation that touches on energy issues in Nova Scotia, comes without a history, comes without a context. Let me assure you that, of course, this does come with a context, and it comes with an important context, one that we have to understand. What does this bill do? This bill essentially says that we should take the full legislative power of the province of Nova Scotia in order to make sure that Nova Scotia Power, Inc. does not try to go more than once a year to the Utility and Review Board to get approval for raising the electricity rates. They should only do us once a year. They shouldn't whack us or try and whack us twice or 3 times or 4 times a year. Why? No, it's a good idea. It's a good idea, but why do we need legislation to do this? We need legislation to do this, apparently, because the government has come to the conclusion that Nova Scotia Power, Inc., in its privatized form, is a predatory corporation, and we need protection from it. Surely they cannot have concluded, the government cannot have concluded anything else based on the evidence of this bill. But is this much of a protection for Nova Scotians? Is this perhaps the kind of thought that should have occurred to the predecessors of that party in 1992 when they privatized the publicly owned Crown Corporation? They should have thought of it then. Has this become a predatory corporation? It's time we thought about this. It's time we look back on the context that has led us to arrive at the point where 14 years later, the government is coming forward with a bill to try to tell our monopoly electrical utility to stop trying to get increases in their rates more than once a year. Because we, the consumers, we, their customers, probably can't afford it. But I think this is the kind of thought that should have occurred to the predecessors of those members opposite in 1992, when, without any solid analysis, they made a decision which they admitted clearly at the time was on a philosophical basis only, that they thought this Crown Corporation should not be in the public sector and should be privatized. That was a momentous decision. It was a momentous policy change in Nova Scotia. It took years, it took decades to move to the point where in 1970 we finally achieved one province-wide, publicly owned monopoly electrical utility. It took decades to arrive at that point, and it was a logical thing to do in 1970 when it was formed. There were good public policy reasons to merge the two main electrical utilities that had emerged, one private, one public. And the objective was to try to make sure that there was reliable electricity service for all portions of Nova Scotia, for all people in Nova Scotia, for all businesses in Nova Scotia, and to make sure that that reliable, necessary service was affordable for the people of Nova Scotia. It was a recognition that when a service is fundamentally necessary to how you carry on your life, and when it's what economists call a natural monopoly, that it should be owned in the public sector. That was the recognition around 1970. Yet 22 years later, for no clearly articulated good public policy reason that would benefit the customers or the shareholders, the public, the Tory government at the time decided to privatize. And now they're giving us a bill to try to tidy up some of the mess. Now, what was the suggestion at the time of privatization? The suggestion was that there were going to be efficiencies, that this was going to be a wonderful thing for the customers. It was going to be good for the public. It was going to be good for the individual homeowners. It was going to be good for the businesses of Nova Scotia. And why was that? It was because the discipline of the private marketplace was apparently going to generate such great efficiencies in how the corporation was run that we didn't have to worry about the fact that we were introducing an extra element of expense into how that corporation was structured. That extra element of expense was the return to the shareholders. Shareholders expect dividends. Shareholders who own shares in electrical utilities expect to be paid dividends. It is a well-known maxim in this kind of business that equity is more expensive than debt. Now, you know what that means? What that means is that for a big company like Nova Scotia Power, it is more expensive for them to raise money by selling shares than it is for them to go to the bond market and borrow money. But when they were a Crown Corporation, with their debt guaranteed by the public of Nova Scotia, they were able to go to the bond market and borrow money at a good rate, a rate that's less than the rate they now have to pay, plus they've got shareholders to whom they have to pay dividends. That's what it means when they say that for companies of that sort, equity, in other words, having shareholders, is more expensive than debt, in other words, having bonds. And the theory was that the company was going to be so efficient under its privatized management, never mind the big salaries that the new management were going to get, but it was going to be so efficient that it wasn't going to be a bad deal for the customers, the captive customers, the 1 million of us who live here in Nova Scotia who are being subjected to this monopoly privatized utility. They were going to be so efficient that it didn't matter that they were going to have to pay more money to their shareholders instead of carrying on the way they were before with debt. Doesn't seem to have worked out that way if we now have a bill in which we have to restrain this predatory corporation from coming more than once a year to turn us upside down and shake us till the change falls out of our pockets. Maybe it's time for the government to look back in earnest and think about whether this was such a good deal. Because we still have a monopoly situation, essentially. There are 5 or 6 small municipal utilities that buy power from Nova Scotia Power and resell within their own town boundaries, but it's essentially a monopoly utility with all of us as captive customers, businesses and homes and commercial establishments alike, and the rates have been going up year after year after year. And the company doesn't exactly seem to have been the best of run companies all the time. Think about what it is that the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board said to the company just a year and a half ago, was it? Maybe 2 years ago at the most, about their coal procurement, their procurement of fuels. You're not being very good in going to the marketplace, the Utility and Review Board said to Nova Scotia Power, and getting the best deal for your fuels that you use to burn to get electricity. And the company admitted it, they agreed. They weren't being all that good. And they were going to go and hire a specialist who was going to know their way around the international coal marketplaces, and they were going to get the best deal so that there would be some kind of benefit in terms of reduced operating expenses at Nova Scotia Power because they'd get their fuel for less. 2 years later, they haven't managed to hire such a person. Well, you know, I don't think the chief operating officer has a reduction in salary because they haven't been able to do that. I don't see a reduction in our rates because they haven't been able to do that. The only good thing that's happened with Nova Scotia Power this year is that Stora was closed down for so many months, their biggest customer, that they didn't have to be generating electricity for part of the time. So where's the benefit? Where's the benefit from this privatization? Nova Scotia Power, since privatization, year in, year out, has generated $100 million of profit. That's more than $1 billion of profit that they've generated, that they've paid out in dividends to their shareholders. Now let's be clear. That's my money and your money and your money and the money of each customer in Nova Scotia who pays their electricity bill. When we talk profits, we're talking about paying our bills to that monopoly company that then uses it, in part, to pay out, since privatization, more than $1 billion in dividends to their shareholders. What could we have done with that $1 billion, even if it had been confined to the electricity sector? Never mind that I could have kept my extra little bit in my pocket, and you could have kept it in yours, and the companies could have kept it in their pockets and made their own individual decisions. Suppose the rates were still the same, but it was a public company. That money could have been used to improve the equipment. Could have been used to improve the environmental controls, to limit emissions. Could have been used to raise salaries for those lines people, the ones who get out there in the dead of winter, in the storms like White Juan, and help us out when the system goes down. Or when that salty fog finds its way. into the system. Who knows how? And if you don't like that excuse, they've got a few others. That money could have been used for a whole variety of other things. I bet that over $1 billion, instead of flowing out of this province into the hands of shareholders, could have been used for good things. And I have to emphasize that point. That money flew out of this province. This is no longer a Nova Scotian-owned company. You shouldn't think that this company is owned by Nova Scotians, that we're just kind of passing the money around amongst ourselves. This is a publicly traded company. What that means is that their shares are available to be purchased by any purchaser who wants to tap into the Toronto Stock Exchange and buy their shares. And believe me, most of the owners of the shares of Nova Scotia Power are not in Nova Scotia. A lot of them are pension funds, a lot of them are big institutional investors, a lot of them are private investors elsewhere. That money left this province. Not every last penny, but most of it certainly left this province, which is in and of itself an economic drain on us. When you go back and you read the Hansard for that time, in 1992, when that bill to privatize Nova Scotia Power was being debated, it is appalling. It is appalling to realize the casualness with which such an important economic decision was made. And now here we are trying to mop up some of the impact of this. Well, I think that it's time the government rethought this. And I would have hoped that if the government was turning its mind to the issue of electricity in Nova Scotia, that it would turn its mind somewhat more expansively to the issues that are involved. Now, I'm not saying that there is, in and of itself, anything wrong with this particular small item that's makes up Bill 20. What I'm saying is that if the government wants to think about the electricity industry, if it wants to think about Nova Scotia Power, if it wants to think about the issues associated with it, maybe we might have seen a more serious bill. Maybe even instead of a bill, we might have seen a policy from the government telling us where it intends to go with the electricity industry. Maybe we might have seen some analysis of what it is that the issues are. Maybe we might have seen some grappling with an issue like energy poverty. There is no shortage of issues around electricity in Nova Scotia that the government could have grappled with, and instead it gives us this little bill. It's not that it's wrong. It's that as soon as you think about it for a minute, you realize how momentous are the issues we're dealing with and how almost irrelevant this bill is. And let's just remind ourselves of what some of these issues are. It's not just the fundamental and dubious decision that was made in 1992 about privatization. There are current issues that are struggling to be dealt with and that we have to deal with, and it makes no sense to postpone dealing with. I have in mind the question of when and how we are going to move to renewables as a major, perhaps even exclusive part of how it is that we generate our electricity in Nova Scotia. I have in mind the issue of what the electricity marketplace is going to look like in Nova Scotia. I have in mind how we're going to deal with big new electricity generating projects like the developments that are going to take place in Newfoundland and Labrador. There's already talk about a national energy grid. Is that going to happen? Should it happen? What does the government say about that? And what about that issue of energy poverty that I mentioned a minute ago? Well, all of these are important issues, and I'll elaborate on a couple of them just to make it clear what it is that the government could have done and probably should have done if it was going to engage on the issue of electricity. If the government is going to bring us a bill about electricity, why don't they bring us a bill that engages with these serious issues? We can't put off forever a serious debate about these issues. It's time. It is time. Well, let's start first with energy poverty, because this bill seems at least to think about the reality of how hard it is for people to pay their bills. Well, today, in the newspapers, we saw people speaking up on behalf of that segment of Nova Scotians who are so poor and have such great difficulty paying their electricity bills that a term has been invented to describe the situation in which they find themselves. That term is energy poverty. So these are people who are having serious problems paying their electricity bill, their home heating bill, any transportation bills, and so on. Energy is getting very expensive. And 2 years ago, year and a half ago perhaps, the issue was raised at the Utility and Review Board. Representatives through the agency of Dalhousie Legal Aid that came to speak on behalf of the poorest of the customers of Nova Scotia Power said to the board, you should create a special system to deal with the poorest customers of Nova Scotia Power. And the board threw up its hands and they said, you know what? We don't have the authority to do that. We do not have the legal authority to do that. In the Utility and Review Board, in the Public Utilities Act, they said, the very act that's being amended by Bill 20 tonight, there is nothing that gives us the power to create a special category for the poorer customers of Nova Scotia Power. Now, an attempt was made to challenge this ruling by the board in court. The court upheld the board. What that means is that if the board interpreted its statute correctly, then it's back to us. It's back to the government. It's back to this House to decide whether we want to create a special category that will protect the poorest of Nova Scotians when it comes to their electricity bills. It's up to us. That's not in here. This tells us you can't go to the board, Nova Scotia Power can't go to the board in order to seek an increase in rates more than once a year, unless there are extraordinary circumstances, apparently. So, to some extent, the poorest of Nova Scotians are protected, along with the rest of us, in the sense that from year to year, they can only have huge increases foisted upon them. But that doesn't seem to me to be really responsive to the issue that was raised by Dalhousie Legal Aid on behalf of the poorest of customers. So why don't we have something to deal with that? And I have to say that although I'm not going to debate the ruling from the Utility and Review Board about its powers, or the ruling of the Court of Appeal when it was called upon to judge what the Utility and Review Board had done, it struck me as a little strange, because there are different categories of payment plans that exist now with the blessing of the board. And some of those categories include special deals, special arrangements for the very largest of customers, like the pulp and paper plants. But no, there's no legal authority to set up a special category for the poorest of customers. There's legal authority to set up a special category for the largest of industrial customers, but no legal authority to set up a special category for the poorest of customers. Well, you know, that seems to me like a meaty issue. This seems to me like exactly the kind of issue the government ought to be thinking about, and if it's going to be amending the Public Utilities Act, they might want to say something about this. Instead, we find that this time, in the current round of hearings before the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board on the latest request for an increase from NSPI, Dalhousie Legal Aid again is going to be raising this issue, and this time they're going to raise it as a charter matter. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms comes into it. Is there some basis, they're now saying, for making out an argument on the basis of the Charter? Well, I'm not going to get into the details of that argument, but it's an interesting point. Unfortunately, what's happening is that the advocates on behalf of the poor are having to go to court and use complex and detailed and, I have to say, extended litigation to try to achieve their end. They could just as well be here in this chamber. They should be having a response from the government. That's what we should see in a Bill 20. We got plenty of omnibus bills in front of us in this session. I don't see why they couldn't have included that in a public utilities bill. They could have done that. Why not? Are we to understand that the government thinks that the present situation is just fine? That it's fine for a special category of rate to exist for the largest of industrial customers, but not a good thing to have a special category of rate for the poorest of customers? If that's what the government thinks, maybe they should be clear and say so. I don't want to read too much into the absence of such a clause in this bill, but it's very tempting. Could you reach a different conclusion? I'm not sure what it is that motivates the government to come forward with something like this that clearly admits that there's a problem, but doesn't really come to grips with it. Doesn't that strike you as odd? It strikes me as odd. But this is just the first item that this bill might have been about, that we might have dealt with. Let's look at the renewables issue. Now, I know that the minister who introduced this bill is a big fan of the Al Gore film, An Inconvenient Truth. This is a wonderful film, and I know that he and others have urged members of this House to see the film. And what does it deal with? Of course, it deals with global climate change. People now recognize, there is wide recognition of the fact that this is one of the major public policy issues of our time. It's something that we should all be engaged with. And yet, what do we see here? This doesn't say to the UARB, when you're judging what it is that Nova Scotia Power is doing, you better make sure that you nudge them in the direction of as much renewables as possible. Doesn't say that. Where's the government's policy on this? Now, they've made some passes at it, they've made some passing statements about it, but you know, we're still waiting to see a comprehensive, progressive energy policy brought forward and implemented by that government. This might have been a time to do that. And the questions are pretty obvious. How far and how rapidly should Nova Scotia move in the direction of abandoning carbon-based generation of electricity and move towards renewables. Now, that's a good, solid public policy question. Some people might think there's such a pressing need for it that we have to do it within 5 or 10 years. Other people might think we've got 30 years. Who knows what the government thinks? Have they embraced the Kyoto objectives? Every time I've asked them here in this House, they've avoided that question. They've avoided responsibility for it. They've said it's up to the feds, let the feds decide. We'll live with what the feds do. Not exactly an adequate policy stance. Nova Scotians are waiting for some direction from the government on electricity policy that relates to this, the most pressing public policy issue of our time. What are we going to do about saving the planet? Pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, it looks, when we get this kind of bill, that Nova Scotians are going to have to wait a long time still. Now let me put it in economic terms. A couple of years ago, under the chairmanship of Professor Fournier from Dalhousie, Robert Fournier of the Oceanography Department, Nova Scotia struck a committee which reported. It was a committee called the Electricity Marketplace Governance Committee. And the report attempted to engage with this whole issue of the economics of the electricity industry in Nova Scotia. Because there are many companies out there known as independent power producers, IPPs, or non-utility generators, NUGs, who want to get into the business of generating electricity, and they're all interested in doing it by renewables. They all want to put up windmills. They all want to get into tidal power. They all want to develop more hydro. They want to do things that are renewable in terms of generating electricity. And so this committee, chaired by Professor Fournier, was asked to think about this. And I have to say, it came back with the most timid of recommendations when it came to opening up the electricity marketplace. And this is unfortunate, and it's also unfortunate that at the time, the government tended to agree that only a small portion of the electricity marketplace in Nova Scotia should be opened up to those IPPs. Now, I'm all for caution when it comes to thinking about how we might transform our electricity marketplace in Nova Scotia. I started out, of course, suggesting that we might rethink whether even the privatization was a good idea. But if we are going to have a privatized system, is there room for independent power producers, and if so, where and how much? Now that's a debate worth having. We should be having that debate. That's something that the government should be showing some leadership on. That's something that they should be bringing to this legislature. That's something that could be included in a Public Utilities Act instead of this small item that we see here. And these issues are complex. We would do well to remind ourselves that where in various parts of the United States they opened up their electricity marketplace to a free, open, private, wheeled system, there were a lot of problems. Companies like Enron got involved. Prices went up to customers. There seems to have been extensive collusion. There seems to have been a lot of price manipulation. There were serious problems. So I'm all for reminding ourselves that we have to be very cautious if we decide we're going to move in that direction. But we've got to have the debate. We can't keep waiting to have this debate. We can't not have it. We can't keep putting it off. We can't avoid it. This is an important public policy issue. This is a major public policy issue. This is something that is happening on the ground already in Nova Scotia. IPPs are out there investing money in buying windmills, in trying to get sites lined up, in trying to get into the business of generating electricity from renewables, and they want to be able to have access to the transmission and distribution system of Nova Scotia Power, and they want to be able to wheel their electricity from their generation stations to their customers. But they can't do it. There was one of the recommendations, recommendation 51, in the Fournier report that essentially said wheeling should be allowed. Wheeling is the technical term, Mr. Speaker, for a generator being able to sell their electricity to a particular customer. Recommendation 51 says allow wheeling. Well, government isn't allowing wheeling. Government hasn't set us up in that way. There have been small moves in that direction. I think an OATT, an open access transmission tariff, has been established, which would set the rate that Nova Scotia Power could charge for moving electricity across its wires, across its transmission and distribution system. So that's a step in that direction. But the independent power producers don't know how much power they can produce. They can't sell it to other customers that they select. What they've got to do is sell it to Nova Scotia Power. Or maybe they can sell it to those 6 small electrical utilities that service small towns like Berwick. Now, this is a very limited opening up of the market. Now, I'm not saying the answers are obvious, but what I'm saying is all the facts should be laid out by the government, which has not only an energy department staffed with, dare we remind ourselves, highly paid experts who are supposed to take the lead in setting energy policy. Well, you know, we should have some leadership from the government, at least in setting out the issues. That would be a desirable thing. But again, we find ourselves languishing as a province when it comes to trying to decide how quickly we're going to move, or if we're going to move at all, towards a new system. Just the other day, we saw one of the hopeful IPPs, the Black River Hydro folks, complaining that they weren't able to negotiate an appropriate deal with Nova Scotia Power. They're coming and saying that they had 3 sites lined up, they had suppliers lined up to help them get their proposal for wind power established, and yet they weren't able to negotiate a deal with Nova Scotia Power that was satisfactory. So Nova Scotia Power is being an obstacle, apparently, and not just on the basis suggested in Bill 20. It's not just that they're wanting to go, apparently the government fears, more than once a year to the Utility and Review Board to ask for rate increases. IPPs are having some difficulty in getting themselves established here. And Black River made a suggestion. They said there should be what are called standard offer contracts. In other words, the Utility and Review Board should be able to set the rates for all comers. IPPs should be able to come along, establish their businesses, sell into the grid, maybe even wheel. But if they're going to sell into the grid, then the Utility and Review Board should have some jurisdiction to set the rates. That's something we proposed as an amendment to some legislation last year. It's not in here, it's not in Bill 20. Why not? Why not? Now, if there's some reason why the government thinks that standard offered contracts are a bad idea or not yet timely, they should say so. All I've seen in the paper so far is the Minister of Energy saying they're not going to happen. There was not going to be any good reason. There was no good reason suggested. There was no reason at all. He just said they're not going to happen. Now, there are other issues associated with electricity here. Are we going to be big-time generators ourselves of electricity and exporters of it to the United States? Well, if tidal energy were ever to be a big success in the Bay of Fundy or elsewhere, especially the Bay of Fundy, maybe we will be exporters. What does the government think about that? We don't know. They haven't told us. Are we going to be electricity importers? Are we going to import electricity from Newfoundland and Labrador or from Quebec or from Ontario, where they're starting to have massive wind farms set up? We don't know. We don't know whether the government thinks that's a good idea. How long will it be that we in Nova Scotia continue to be last in the queue when it comes to policy changes in this area? This makes no sense. Every once in a while, when the government thinks that there's a small issue that might look like it's acting, when there's a small issue that makes it look like they're taking some steps, when there's a small issue that makes it look as if they're responding to the needs of the middle class, they'll take a step. Bill 20. Nova Scotia Power, please don't go to the Utility and Review Board more than once a year in order to ask for your 5, 9, 14% increases, please. Well, that's what Bill 20 says. Mr. Speaker, I understand the bill. I've read the explanatory note. I've read every word. I can see what the bill is doing. But I have to tell you and every other member in this House that it is just not responsive to the situation in which we as a province, in which we as a nation find ourselves, and it's about time we took the appropriate action. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak on Bill number 20. And Mr. Speaker, I know that the previous speaker was questioning where this bill comes from, and I can tell you this bill looks awful familiar because all members of this House would know that this is legislation that was previously tabled by the Liberal caucus. Now the question is, why was the bill introduced by the Liberal caucus? And maybe I can answer a few of the questions by the member from Halifax-Shabukto. We have seen under this government, Mr. Speaker, an unprecedented amount of increases granted to Nova Scotia Power with absolute silence from this government while each of those increases has taken place. Mr. Speaker, our attempts to try to get the government to rein in the situation and to be able to protect Nova Scotian consumers fell on deaf ears. So the question became, what can we get the government to do, at least as a minimum, to protect consumers here in this province that they will actually be prepared to move forward on? Mr. Speaker, last year when we saw Nova Scotia Power come forward, not once, but twice, asking for further increases to the cost of electricity to Nova Scotians, it became clear that as a minimum, the government should at least look to limit the utility to one rate increase per year. And today, there we have Bill number 20. But does Bill 20 address the concerns that our caucus has to protect Nova Scotians from these ever-increasing costs and rate increases by Nova Scotia Power? Not at all. It is but a small step, but yet it does fail to deal with the variety of issues that are being faced by Nova Scotians on the energy front. Now, Mr. Speaker, allow me as well to mention what the member from Halifax-Shabukto was talking about and the need to have a lower power rate for Nova Scotians of limited means and limited income. And he talks about the court case going forward. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would remind the member from Halifax Chebucto as well that it is the Liberal caucus that brought forward legislation that would have permitted the government to give instructions to Nova Scotia Power to have a preferential rate for low-income Nova Scotians. Had the government adopted this, there would be no need for this charter challenge by Dalhousie Legal Aid, because at that point the UARB would have been in a position to be able to instruct Nova Scotia Power as a utility to have lower rates for low-income Nova Scotians. And the question is this a new idea or something that's never been tried before? Not at all, Mr. Speaker, because once again, this is what's in place in Bangor. Now, why is Bangor of relevance to Nova Scotians? Because we now know that Nova Scotia Power's parent company, Emera, bought out Bangor Hydro a few years ago. Once they bought it out, they kept operating it, and amazingly, they kept this lower preferential rate for low-income earners in Bangor. So if that's what exists, it's basically the same company. They can do it in Bangor for low-income earners in that state. Why can we not do the same here in Nova Scotia? To do so, as the URB has pointed out, they cannot at this point instruct Nova Scotia Power to do so. But if the government brought forward that legislation, it would force the hand of Nova Scotia Power, and it would be able to address the needs of low-income earners in this province. Because up to now, the precedent this government has set is that Nova Scotia Power is going to get a rate increase every year. And that's what we've seen. And I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, when I heard the Premier say during Nova Scotia Power's recent announcement of their rate application this fall that his government would vigorously defend the interests of Nova Scotians, well, that's about the fourth time in the fourth rate hearing that I've heard this vigorous defense. And if it's the same vigorous defense that we're going to get this fall that brought us 8 and 9 and 12% rate increases over the past number of years, then, Mr. Speaker, I think that speaks volumes of just how interested that the Premier and this government is to try to get control over the costs of electricity here in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, we all know, especially for low-income earners who are on Department of Community Services benefits, the Minister of Community Services will be aware herself, their benefits has not increased by 8% or 9% or 12% each year. They've been asked to live on the same income while the cost of electricity, which for most, I would say a great portion of DCS clients, is a necessity. They haven't seen their benefits increase. And the government sat silently and watched this utility get increase after increase. Mr. Speaker, it's not responsible and it's not reasonable. And even if the government had turned around and said, well, we can't control what the UARB says, we can't control the price of oil, but you know what? Where we can, we're at least going to increase the benefits of community services clients to make sure, especially those who rely upon electricity as their primary source of heat, that they are not going to be negatively impacted by these increases. Yet that was not done. And there's no even talk of doing that. No suggestion at all coming from the minister or from the government that they are going to increase the rates. Now, Mr. Speaker, only time will tell whether removing the provincial portion of the HST off of home heating, especially electricity, is going to have a long-term benefit for Nova Scotians. Because how is removing an 8% tax going to help if this fall an 8 or 9% increase is going to be granted to Nova Scotia Power? Where is the savings? And how is that going to help in the long run? Now, Mr. Speaker, there was a program here that could provide real relief for Nova Scotians. It was Keep the Heat, and it was meant to help the lowest of income earners here in our province. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we know that that program will not exist this fall or this winter. That same program last year also helped attract over $200 for low-income earners from the federal government. That will not be available this year as well, because why should the federal government be helping with the cost of home heating and electricity for low-income earners when the province isn't interested in doing it? So that's lost as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, Bill number 20 is a baby step. hopefully is a step that tells Nova Scotia Power that is unacceptable, the continued increases that they've brought forward. Yes, there has been some increased costs. We all know that. But we also know that Nova Scotia Power has been caught by the UARB at being deficient, an example, in their coal purchasing. And Mr. Speaker, we also have to look at what this province is doing to tell Nova Scotia Power that they have to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. Mr. Speaker, I visited one of the power generating stations, and I remember that the manager there said that they were the best performer for their size power plant. I believe he said 75% efficiency. And the gentleman that was with me, after listening to the manager say that a few times, said, so what is your plans to increase that efficiency? I said, well, we're number one. Why should we? There was no interest at getting better. They were content at saying they're number one right now, and they were able to brag that, but there was absolutely no vision of how they were going to get better or how to become less dependent on coal. And we have a government that's not pushing them to do so. A government that has sat silent and has been in partnership, in essence, with Nova Scotia Power during each of these rate increases. We have a Minister of Energy. The Department of Energy, I believe, was created in 2000, 2001, about 5 years now. Speaker, you'd be familiar with that. This is the fourth Minister of Energy in about 5 years. Number 4. So we haven't even had a minister in that department for much more than a year. No surprise when you look at the fact that we have a Minister of Energy that publicly stated that he was concerned that the wind might stop blowing in Nova Scotia. Now, I've mentioned that before. We know what kind of embarrassment that brought. Same minister that when he was asked about the situation in Point Tupper, my riding, where an LNG terminal is proposed, when it was announced that the attempts to secure a supply contract had failed, they asked the Minister of Energy, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm very hopeful. So they said, well, no, that's nice, but what are you going to do? And he answered again, well, I'm very hopeful that they'll get a contract. And when they asked the third time, it was the same answer. There was no indication of, I'm going to dedicate more staff, we're going to work aggressively as a government, we're going to make sure all resources are exhausted to make sure that that facility is going to be a success, a supply contract will be secured. That's the answer Nova Scotians wanted to hear. But that's not the answer we got. The answer we got was he was hopeful. And then again, Mr. Speaker, when they went to the Strait area, just last week, I raised the issue in question period, when they met with the Chamber of Commerce, along the Department of Energy and Emera, met with them about the proposed bullet line for the Irving LNG facility that would go direct to the U.S. market. Strait Area Chamber of Commerce asked the Department of Energy, what are you going to do at the National Energy Board hearings? And while the Premier and the Minister would have us believe that all along they were going to fight Nova Scotia's best interests, you had someone like Mayor Billy Joe McLean, former member of this legislature, former member of the Conservative Party, Cabinet Minister, who publicly said, I can't understand why the Department of Energy officials couldn't tell us what their position will be at the National Energy Board hearings. Yet the day after, the Premier knew exactly what their position was, and he was arguing about how strenuous they were going to fight for our interests. Why those officials remained silent in the Strait area, I don't know. The Premier's familiar with that area. He'd know who the members of the Chamber of Commerce are. But that's what they walked away, wondering why is our government not standing up for us? Why is the Department of Energy not taking the lead in making sure our interests are protected? But how many more things does that apply to, Mr. Speaker? It's Nova Scotia Power. It's a minister who fears the wind's going to stop blowing, doesn't have any sort of plan to help with the establishment of LNG facilities here in our province. And then again, at the end of the day, we'll have to wait to see exactly what presentation they did give to the National Energy Board. How rigorous was their cross-examination? What evidence did they challenge? Only time will tell. It's taking place right now. I know, Mr. Speaker, the Warden of Richmond County is there, doing his best on behalf of the municipality to defend our interests, and I commend him for that.
Good ward.
New Warden of Richmond County, and I'm sure he'll be here one day, and I'll properly introduce him here in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, but he's there fighting for us, and I know certainly what his position is, and he's going to do everything he can to protect the interests of the LNG facility in Point Tupper against any unfair competition from New Brunswick. Yet, I don't have that same sense of confidence from the Department of Energy after seeing what they had to say at the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Speaker, we have spoken before as well, expressing our concern over the fact that this government fails to deal with the independent power producers here in this province. We have such a tremendous opportunity here in Nova Scotia to be leaders, and instead, based on the government's actions and based on the statements of the Minister of Energy, we're more of a mockery than anything else. And it's such a lost opportunity. And when you talk about people who are interested in green energy and renewable energy, it's an excitement that they have about what they see for the future, the opportunities, employment-wise, energy efficiency-wise, environmentally, all of that. They're very excited. Yet this government has done its best to douse their excitement and to beat them down and to say you're not a priority. As was mentioned before, when the Minister of Energy is asked, will you allow independent power producers to sell directly to consumers, he says no. Not no because of this reason or no because here's what we're concerned about. It's just a straight out no. So we have a monopoly here in this province, in Nova Scotia Power, that seems to be protected by a government. Although they have studies that they've commissioned which have recommended opening up of our markets in a responsible and reasonable fashion. And here's a tremendous opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, you'd be familiar with this. If I'm not mistaken, you were the minister at the time when this report was brought in, and I know you brought forward some legislation dealing with some of the small recommendations that were in the report. But we have a tremendous opportunity here. And we're a province now that faces many challenges. If I'm not mistaken, we are home to the 5th largest polluter in all of Canada. And I'm not sure if that's something that the Minister of Tourism wants to put in his Come to Life campaign to advertise the fact that we have a utility here that is making Nova Scotia, our small little province, the 5th largest polluter in all of Canada. That's something for all of us to be embarrassed about, Mr. Speaker. That's something for us to be saying collectively, here is what we're going to try to do to change that, to make Nova Scotia a green province, to make Nova Scotia a responsible province. And yet, as long as the government continues to be silent on these types of issues, and instead, the only thing they're offering us is Bill 20, a bill that the Minister of Environment and Labour knows was previously introduced by the Liberals. In fact, it's the same minister that asked for a consultation last week regarding the amount of hours and when a break was going to be given, knowing that there was a Liberal legislation tabled today that dealt with that very issue. So that's 2 bills, but that's fine, Mr. Speaker. I think the leader of the NDP was always fond of saying he has no problems with the government taking their ideas when they're good ideas, and we say the same thing over from our party. But, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are not seeing their incomes keep up with the increases that Nova Scotia Power is getting. There's apparently no vision from either Nova Scotia Power or this government to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And the time has come where the coal mines are closed, that Nova Scotians are no longer prepared to turn a blind eye to the pollution that is being created here in this province. And while there are opportunities at the government's disposal to be able to have more renewable energy, and yet they fail to take action on that, is completely unacceptable. Nova Scotians, and especially our youth, deserve better. They deserve to know, because our young people are so concerned about the environment, they deserve to know what we are doing as legislators to try to improve our environment here in this province, to make sure that we have a reliable supply of energy and electricity, but that we are doing so in the most responsible fashion. And I again remind the Premier that when you have a monopoly utility that can say, we are #1 in efficiency at a power plant, who's then asked, what are you going to do to try to become more efficient? That answers, we have no plans because we're #1, and so we are under no obligation to try to become more efficient. That's unacceptable. And the reality is that Nova Scotians have now become educated enough on this issue. When you hear Nova Scotians talking now about renewable energy, you hear seniors talking about it. There's been an education that has gone on in the last number of years, which has been absolutely remarkable, Mr. Speaker. But the days of the government turning a blind eye and doing nothing is clearly not acceptable for Nova Scotians anymore. It probably never was acceptable, but certainly the level of education now, Nova Scotians know there are other options. They know there are other ways to do it. And in this case, the technology is out there. We're not being asked to create new technology. And I think, Mr. Speaker, of my time, my brief time in the Ministry of the Environment, we were the leaders in recycling. We were the leaders in composting. Mr. Speaker, you'd know yourself, we had people coming from Russia. We had people coming from all sorts of countries to see what is it that little Nova Scotia is doing that they have had such success in reducing their landfills. No more burning of waste in our province. That we were seeing such a high compliance rate of people who are recycling and composting. Why are they not doing the same thing on energy? Because no one's coming here to see what we're doing on energy, on renewable energy, on diverting our reliance on fossil fuels. And it's unfortunate because Nova Scotians are known to be leaders. And I give that as one example. And yes, as the Minister of Service Nova Scotia says, we are still leaders in the area of recycling, and that's something to be proud of. And what my question to him is, why are we not leaders in renewable energy? The opportunity is there for us. The wind will not stop blowing. In fact, the Minister of Energy should know that he has studies showing that we're actually a prime area for windmills because of where we live. Who would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that we could say the wind and the weather of Nova Scotia could be turned into a positive? Well, there's one opportunity. Mr. Speaker, it's the government itself that will have to force the hand of this monopoly called Nova Scotia Power to act. And I know the Mayor of Halifax, Shabukto, took us back to 1992. And in 1992, both the Premier and I were still in university. So I don't think we can be held responsible for the decisions at the time to privatize Nova Scotia Power. But today, both the Premier and I and all members of this House have a responsibility to Nova Scotians to make sure that we have new ways of producing electricity and energy in this province, that we stop our dependence on fossil fuels. It's not going to happen overnight, Mr. Speaker, but we need a vision that's going to move us forward. The opportunity is there. The Premier has all of the information he needs to do it. All he needs now is the political will, and I can't think of a better time under this minority situation, based on the comments he's heard from the NDP, based on the comments that he's seeing from the Liberal caucus, that this House could be united in once again making Nova Scotia leaders in energy, and leaders that we can be proud of, and leaders that generations to come will thank us for having shown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to have a few minutes here to speak on this bill, Bill number 20, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act. But really, Mr. Speaker, it's all about Nova Scotia Power and limiting their right or their ability to apply for rate increases at will. And it's stating that the bill should allow for only one rate application in a 12-month period. And that seems to me like a rather common sense thing. And I know all of us as individuals, we try to budget in our home or our small business or whatever the case might be, and on a yearly basis. I can think of, for example, in most households, individuals want to decide whether they're able during that calendar year to perhaps fix their roof, put new asphalt shingles on it, or perhaps if the furnace is getting old and want to update their heating system, new well or new water system, whatever the case might be. It seems logical that on a yearly basis you plan for what you can do within your budget, and I don't think it's any different in our own personal lives. If we need a new vehicle or new car, then you plan ahead for that, and within the calendar year maybe you can think you're going to get a better transportation or whatever the case might be. So really it should be no different, Mr. Speaker, for a corporation such as Nova Scotia Power, that they should be able to plan their estimates and look at their balance sheet and make the determination on what it is they can do in the 12 months coming up in the calendar year or their fiscal year, whichever the case might be. Certainly they're asking of us, or asking Nova Scotians to be prepared for a rocky road or to have to accept more than one increase, and I don't think it's unreasonable to look at them and ask for a month or a yearly plan at a time. Because many Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, are in a very difficult position. They're not able to handle more than one increase in a year. And Nova Scotia Power just received an 8.9% increase earlier this year, and ask Nova Scotians to pay a second or a third or a fourth increase in the same calendar year, I think is unreasonable. Because many Nova Scotians are on a fixed income. They're on a pension or they're on a salary. There's very few people, I guess, that really are not on a fixed income. I guess the only exceptions I could think of would be somebody that's on a commission sales basis, or perhaps a small business person where their income actually may fluctuate up and down, might be very good, it might be very poor. But for most Nova Scotians, they're on a very fixed amount of income, and to ask for a second or a third increase on their electricity bill in the same year, I think is unreasonable. And it certainly would create some hardship for a number of Nova Scotians if they're asked to do for that. And certainly even one increase a year for some people is very, very difficult. And I can think of one young couple called me here about a month ago, and happens to be a mixed marriage, and they have 3 children each. So in their family, there's actually 6 children, and their power was cut off because they had failed to pay their bill. And it was in early October, and the weather's starting to get a bit colder, and they had no heat system, they had no lights, and the darkness was coming sooner in the evening. All they had was a few candles, and provide light or for the children to do their homework after dark, or a few candles might even provide a wee heat, but it really wasn't very much. So we called the Nova Scotia Power rep that we deal with out of Truro, and talked to her, and was able to get some resolution to their problem, and they were able to get their power back on. And now when I drive by, I do see the lights on in the window. But it's quite traumatic, certainly to a couple or to anybody when they lose their power. And so they're not in a position to afford even one increase, let alone 2 or more increases in a year. As MLAs, Mr. Speaker, in our constituency offices, we deal with a lot of individuals and families that are in a very poor position. They don't have any extra dollars to live off of. I can think of one lady that comes quite regularly into my constituency office. She's about 64 years old. She's on social assistance, and she has a very small apartment where she pays for her heat and lights. And she has a shelter allowance that she's given through the Department of Community Services, but she's certainly very much on a fixed income, and she has an amount of assistance that's very minimal. She's always juggling whether she can buy food or pay for her rent or buy her medications that she needs. There's never enough money to go around, and certainly if there was another power increase for her, it would be very difficult. And so there's individuals like that are on the poorest of the poor in our society that certainly it would be difficult for any man or woman or family to be able to afford an extra increase in their power bill. So certainly, as some of my colleagues had mentioned earlier, the talk of a preferential rate, I guess, for low-income people. Well, this lady that I see quite regularly at my constituency office would fit the profile perfectly, and there's many Nova Scotians that are well below the poverty line, and a second or a third increase in their power bill would be just impossible for them. So I think was mentioned the idea of a special rate for low-income people a preferential rate would make a whole lot of sense. So those are the type of people that we need, that most need the help, and it would be good, certainly, if Nova Scotia Power could come up with a rate that would best address the low-income people. And it was mentioned earlier, there is a precedence for this in the state of Maine. They have a low-income preferential rate in Bangor that is providing help to the lowest of the low-income people in that state, and certainly would be good if in this province the same was provided. I notice in the bill, Mr. Speaker, there's talk about, I guess, an escape clause or a way out. It's asking that there only be one rate increase in any 12-month period, but there's an exception if there's a substantial financial harm generated to Nova Scotia Power. Certainly, I wonder if that's in mind for the shareholders of the corporation, if there's a substantial financial harm. But really, Mr. Speaker, the people that are most harmed by this second rate increase in a calendar year or even more would be the poor of this province. And I think providing this escape clause is not necessarily in the best interest of Nova Scotians. And so if there's some case made for a substantial financial harm, I think we should also be thinking of the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor in this province who need the help the most. So, Mr. Speaker, what are some of the alternatives to perhaps rather than a rate increase? Is there something else that could be done by Nova Scotia Power to perhaps lower their need for further increases? And certainly, I believe, Mr. Speaker, there is. Instead of increases, Nova Scotia Power, I think, certainly could look at conservation measures. Could they trim their costs? Could they become more effective? Is there some trimming within their labor force or within their method of operation that would allow for more efficiency in their business? And then instead of asking for further money, perhaps they could trim the similar amount of money from more efficiency within their business. And one thing I think certainly that could be done, Mr. Speaker, is some type of incentive program that they could offer homeowners or offer businesses, to look at conservation measures, that methods that would use less power, and probably in part and parcel with that would be some type of education program. Like even energy efficient light bulbs is a very small example, or low pressure shower heads. These are little things that we need more education on to let people know that there's ways that we all can save power. And I think there's some emphasis not only on Nova Scotia Power, but probably on government as well to help educate all of us on better ways that we can conserve energy in this province. A further method that's been talked about already is replacing the coal sources that are burned by most of the generating stations of Nova Scotia Power. I know in the county that I come from, in Pictou, there's a couple generating plants there. In Trenton, Trenton number 6, which is the newer of the coal generating stations, and then Trenton number 5, which certainly has been causing a number of problems in the environment and in health problems in Pictou County over the last over the last 3 or 4 decades, or in the number of years that it's been operating. And I think it's possible, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotia Power could look at alternative methods to produce their electricity. For example, instead of burning coal, is it possible to use natural gas? We have natural gas that we're producing right off of Sable Island, just off our coast. It comes ashore at Goldboro, and then it comes right into Pictou County. It travels within a few miles of the Trenton generating station. And why couldn't some way be found to tap into that energy source and burn a cleaner alternative fossil fuel, such as natural gas, and burn it in the Trenton number 5 at in the town of Trenton for electricity that's generated for our area. Alternate sources of power, you know, have been talked about, like tidal power has got a whole lot of potential for Nova Scotia. Solar power, wind power certainly is being generated more and more, but there's much more potential in Nova Scotia to produce practically all of our energy from renewable resources, and especially from the wind. It was mentioned earlier that Nova Scotia Power is the 5th largest polluter in all of Canada, and certainly the residents in the Trenton hillside area are very, very cognizant of that, in that we have a lot of problems there that are created by that number 5 generating station. I'm thinking particularly of all the particulate emissions that are coming out of the stack that have been falling on homes and on cars, and it's very evident. Sometimes you can wipe it off with your fingers. It's easy to see. And not only the, I guess it's fly ash is really what the common name for it is, but it's causing many problems for residents over many years. But it's the unseen things that are perhaps as much a problem as any that the Nova Scotia Power Plant is producing. Things like sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, mercury, and other air quality problems that are generating some major difficulties. And this has been ongoing for a long time, and certainly full credit to Peter Boyles and his Trenton Hillside Environmental Watch Group that have been bringing this to the attention of government, of the Department of the Environment, of the Department of Health. And it's really, Mr. Speaker, the concern about health issues and the allegedly causing health problems around cancer and heart disease and so on. So, there's a number of things that can be done to improve the what Nova Scotia Power is doing to generate electricity in this province, from renewable energy sources to replacing the coal burning that they're using at Lingan or at Trenton number 5 or Dartmouth or wherever it's produced. One thing that Nova Scotia Power has done they just announced recently was an improvement to Trenton Generating Station number 5 was I believe it's called a bag system. It's going to cost or an investment of $45 million by the company, and it's a step in the right direction. It's going to take out a number of the pollutants before they are released into the air, especially the particulate matter. And I think it's, like I said, a step in the right direction. But it's slow in coming. It's going to be this year before they file with UARB to get the permission to do it. Then next year, I believe there's some of the engineering work that will be done. And in 2008, the construction will be undertaken, and then in 2009 before it's actually completed. So it's a 3-year, 4-year project, and it's a long time. Certainly for residents in the Trenton Hillside area, they've been looking for a solution. They welcome this, but they were just wondering if it can be done much sooner. It does seem like a long time to install this particular system, and so they're looking forward to that. The other concern certainly is over the source of coal that is being used by Nova Scotia Power, and right now a lot of it is imported from offshore. It's coming from Colombia or Venezuela, and there's concerns in some of those countries over human rights abuses and the way some of the labor practices that are used in the mines in those countries, and I know Nova Scotia Power will say that they're strictly from mines that are where those problems do not occur, but there's questions raised around the human rights violations that are occurring in some of the mining areas in Colombia, in particular. So, Mr. Speaker, those are a few of the comments that I want to add here on this particular bill, and well, I think it's good to limit the 12-month time period for Nova Scotia Power to be able to apply for rate increases. There's a whole lot more to Nova Scotia Power that needs to be discussed. So with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I will adjourn debate, and another day we'll listen to what others have to say.
The Honourable, it's not the hour at all. The Honourable, that's it. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes the government's business for today. I move the House be adjourned to sit again tomorrow, Tuesday, commencing at 12 noon to 6 p.m. After the daily routine question period, we'll introduce public bills for second reading, numbers 5, 9, 15, 67, 84.
Motion is carried. We stand adjourned until tomorrow.